There is a strange and growing experience shared quietly by many people today, an experience that does not fit neatly into the categories we normally use to describe human emotion. It isn't loneliness in the traditional sense. It isn't alienation in the sociological sense. It isn't even existential dread. It is something subtler and more elusive, a sense of drifting to the edges of the shared human map, precisely at the moment one becomes more aware of the terrain. This experience begins not when a person withdraws from society, but when they look at society with a clearer gaze. It begins when the fog of inherited assumptions thins, when the narratives that were once unquestioned start revealing their seams, when the world's mechanisms, political, psychological, economic, symbolic, become not only visible, but painfully obvious. And with this clarity comes not triumph, but a kind of cognitive solitude that is difficult to articulate without sounding melodramatic or delusional. In earlier eras of humanity, this sensation would have been almost impossible. Human beings lived within tight circles of meaning, where the symbolic worlds of individuals overlapped almost completely. People rarely stepped outside the mythic horizon of their own group. You could disagree or question, but the framework that held your questions was still fundamentally shared. You could wander around the village, but you were always walking on the same ground as everyone else. But we no longer share a single ground. We share a planet, yes, but not a worldview. We inhabit continents of thought so distinct that sometimes two people standing side by side looking at the same event effectively see two different universes. The divergence is not merely one of opinion, it is one of perception, sense-making, and internal narrative coherence. Technology has amplified this divergence to unprecedented levels. We carry devices that feed us personalized worlds, nibbling our attention into isolated chambers, where the idea of a collective reality becomes less plausible each day. And while it might appear that this fragmentation only affects those caught in the whirlpool of sensationalized media, it impacts the reflective and self-aware even more intensely. Those who attempt to step outside the algorithmic hallucinations, to observe them rather than be consumed by them, often find themselves in a peculiar in-between state, neither immersed in the collective dream nor entirely liberated from it. It is here, in this liminal territory, that conscious isolation emerges. For some, it surfaces the moment they begin to see how economic structures subtly shape our desires. For others, it comes when they recognize the psychological patterns that animate collective behavior. And for a growing number, it arrives through witnessing the early tremors of technological transformation, especially the rapid evolution of artificial intelligence, whose implications we can sense but not yet fully comprehend. The more one perceives these structural forces, the more difficult it becomes to participate in trivial conversations that glide along the surface of things. You begin to listen differently. Small talk feels like theater. Arguments feel like rehearsed scripts. The public sphere feels like a choreography of misunderstandings. And yet, what choice do we have? Depth cannot always be spoken. Insight cannot always be shared. There are truths that, when articulated casually, create discomfort or confusion or defensiveness. When someone has glimpsed a larger pattern, they cannot easily fold themselves back into the tight corners of conventional discourse. And so, they grow quiet. Not out of superiority, not out of disdain, but from the recognition that language fails them more often than it serves them. This silence is often mistaken for withdrawal. But in truth, it is a form of adaptation. It is a protective mechanism meant to preserve the integrity of an inner understanding that has not yet found a home in the external world. Yet the danger here is immense. A person who perceives deeply but lacks a community capable of receiving that perception can drift into despair. Awareness without resonance becomes a burden. There is a risk of sliding into nihilism, into a conviction that meaningful change is impossible. that humanity is trapped in self-reinforcing loops of superficiality and distraction. This is not an intellectual stance, but an emotional one, a heaviness, born from seeing too much and being able to share too little. And yet, this very isolation may be part of a larger developmental arc, not just individually but collectively. Humanity has reached a stage where our technologies have outrun our mythologies. We have created machines that can outthink us in narrow domains, networks that can manipulate us at scale, and systems so complex that no single mind can understand them. Our capacities have expanded, but our frameworks for meaning have not kept pace. We have more information than any generation before us, yet we lack the interpretive scaffolding to make sense of it without collapsing under the weight. This mismatch is not a personal failure, it is a species-level growing pain. In this transitional era, many find themselves caught between worlds: the fading world of inherited narratives and the emerging world of new consciousness that has not yet found its form. Those who feel this tension most acutely are often the ones who cannot pretend that nothing is happening. They cannot unsee what they have seen. But if conscious isolation is the problem, it is also the seed of the solution, because it is precisely these individuals, those who have wandered off the well-trodden paths, who are capable of imagining new forms of community, new languages of understanding, new ways of relating that are not flattened by oversimplification. History shows us again and again that transformation begins at the margins. It begins with people who feel out of place in the old story and therefore become the early carriers of the new one. The challenge then is not merely to endure conscious isolation, but to learn how to hold it with grace, to cultivate a presence that neither hides nor imposes, to seek connection not based on agreement but on authenticity, to experiment with small circles of deep conversation, to build spaces, physical, digital, emotional, where truth is not a threat and complexity is not an inconvenience. We must learn to be companions to each other across different layers of awareness, recognizing that consciousness itself is a fluid landscape, not a hierarchy. Every person has areas of profound insight and areas of profound blindness. When we remember this, we approach others not as puzzles to solve or minds to correct, but as fellow travelers navigating an uncertain terrain. Perhaps conscious isolation is not the end of connection, but the beginning of a more mature form of it, one that does not depend on uniformity, but on mutual recognition, one that welcomes complexity instead of fleeing from it, one that sees the human mind not as an island, but as a coastline constantly reshaped by tides of experience. If this is true, then the discomfort many feel today is not a pathology. It is a transition, not a collapse, but a metamorphosis. We are learning, slowly and painfully, to outgrow the shallow forms of togetherness that once sufficed. We are preparing, whether we realize it or not, for a deeper communion. That requires a different kind of courage, the courage to remain open, to remain curious, to remain humane, even when the world feels incomprehensible. And perhaps, when the dust of this transformation settles, we will find that the isolation that once separated us has become the very bridge that connects us. They know something we don't. And the unsettling truth is that this has been the rule rather than the exception throughout the long and turbulent story of our species. Every civilization rests on the foundation of an uneven distribution of knowledge, and the great turning points in history arise not only from what people do know, but from what they are never allowed to know. Today, this asymmetry is not merely a relic of ancient hierarchies or monarchic secrecy. It is the engine driving the most transformative changes on the planet. It defines the relationship between individuals and institutions, citizens and algorithms, societies, and the opaque systems that increasingly shape them. We inhabit a world in which crucial insights about our behavior, our vulnerabilities, and our future trajectories are collected, analyzed, and acted upon long before we are even aware that such insights existed. This gap is widening, and the consequences reach far beyond the familiar tensions between governments and populations. The asymmetry is becoming embedded in the architecture of our daily lives, woven into the platforms we use, the environments we inhabit, and the identities we project. The core of this asymmetry lies in the quiet accumulation of data. Not merely data in the sense of what we type or click or record, but data in its most intimate form, the thousands of subconscious micro-expressions, impulsive decisions, and emotional cues we give off without noticing. Modern systems learn from us through patterns we can't perceive and correlations we would never imagine. They see relationships in our actions that we do not see in ourselves. And those who control these systems, whether institutions, organizations, or specialized elites, gain a vantage point over human behavior that is historically unprecedented. They know what motivates us, what frightens us, what persuades us, and what breaks us. They can predict not only what we will do, but what we are likely to become. This situation raises a deeper philosophical question. What happens to human agency when the mechanisms guiding our choices are invisible to us? For centuries, we believed that humans were the authors of their own desires, that our decisions flowed from inner narratives shaped by culture, family, and personal experience. But this belief becomes fragile when confronted by systems capable of mapping the neural and emotional terrain from which these desires emerge. If institutions possess better models of our minds than we do, then autonomy becomes less of a birthright and more of an illusion maintained for comfort. A person who does not know themselves as well as an external observer cannot be truly free, because freedom requires self-knowledge. This knowledge gap becomes even more significant when it concerns the future. Predictions about societal behavior, economic disruption, and political movements are increasingly derived from complex models that learn from massive datasets. These models can forecast social trends in the same way meteorologists forecast storms, not with perfect accuracy, but with enough precision to prepare and strategize. The institutions that have access to such predictive systems can maneuver faster and more effectively than the public that must navigate the outcomes blindly. When a small group knows what is likely to happen long before the majority does, power begins to concentrate, not overtly but through anticipatory action. They allocate resources before scarcity arises, build narratives before crises erupt, and position themselves advantageously before the rest of society understands what is unfolding. This ability to act preemptively transforms knowledge into a strategic weapon, but what they know is not only predictive, it is also diagnostic. They identify structural weaknesses, economic, political, psychological, within societies and within individuals. They know which communities are vulnerable to outrage, which are susceptible to distrust, which respond strongly to fear, and which can be swayed through the promise of belonging. These maps of human fragility become tools. They can be used for protection, for manipulation, or for control. The intentions behind them are often hidden, but the effects manifest in the emotional climate of nations. Sudden waves of anxiety, polarization, and suspicion rarely arise spontaneously. They often reflect the deliberate activation of psychological triggers that large-scale data analysis has made visible. The asymmetry deepens when we consider the types of knowledge that remain inaccessible to ordinary individuals. The mechanisms behind many modern systems are kept deliberately opaque, protected by intellectual property laws, security protocols, or technical complexity. People interact with tools and platforms that influence their thoughts and behaviors, yet they lack clear insight into how these tools function or why they operate the way they do. This opacity is not merely a technical inconvenience, It fosters dependency. If you cannot understand the system, you cannot question it, and if you cannot question it, you cannot resist its influence. Thus, an epistemic divide grows. Those who understand the algorithms and those who are governed by them, this divide replicates an ancient dynamic. For much of human history, priests, scholars, or rulers claimed exclusive access to sacred knowledge, cosmic truths, or secret doctrines. They asserted that ordinary people lacked the comprehension necessary to grasp the deeper structure of reality. Today, the guardians of knowledge are engineers, data scientists, and algorithmic architects. Their domain is no longer the metaphysical, but the computational. Yet the psychological effect is similar, a public instructed to trust the expertise of those who understand the machinery, despite having no way to verify or challenge that expertise. The more complex and indispensable the machinery becomes, the more this trust too RNS into dependency and dependency into vulnerability. The implications for democracy are profound. Democratic systems presume that citizens understand enough about their society to make informed decisions. They presume a shared epistemic space, however imperfect, in which public debate is possible. But when knowledge becomes stratified to such an extent that ordinary people cannot realistically comprehend the structures shaping their choices, democratic participation begins to weaken. Citizens may still vote, protest, or debate, but they do so without full awareness of the underlying forces influencing their opinions. The democratic ritual remains, but the substance erodes. A population that cannot see the levers of power cannot meaningfully pull them. At the same time, the asymmetry is not confined to institutions versus individuals. It also exists between different regions and nations. Some societies accumulate technological capability and data infrastructure at incredible speeds, becoming knowledge superpowers, while others remain dependent on external systems. This imbalance has geopolitical consequences. Countries with advanced predictive technology can foresee global trends and prepare accordingly, while others must react after the fact. Those who know what the future is likely to bring can shape it, while those who do not are shaped by it. The global order thus tilts toward those with superior knowledge, even if their population size, landmass, or natural resources are modest. This imbalance also affects culture. In many regions, most cultural consumption, music, films, news, humor, even interpersonal communication passes through platforms that analyze behavioral data at scale. These platforms know which cultural expressions resonate with which groups, and they can amplify certain narratives while diminishing others. This creates a feedback loop. What people consume influences what they believe, and what they believe generates more data that refines the system's ability to shape future beliefs. Over time, entire cultural landscapes can be nudged in specific directions without any central directive, guided instead by algorithms optimized for engagement or influence. People sense the shifts but cannot identify the cause. They know something is changing but cannot explain why. Another dimension of the asymmetry comes from the ability to simulate humans. The institutions that gather enormous datasets can train systems capable of predicting how millions of individuals will respond to a particular message, product, or political slogan. These simulations need not be perfect. They only need to be sufficiently accurate to guide strategy. If you can simulate a society, you can test narratives before releasing them, identify potential backlash before it occurs, and craft messages that minimize resistance. This gives enormous power to those who operate such systems. They can rehearse complex social scenarios in virtual environments, while the public experiences only the final, polished performance. In contrast, ordinary individuals cannot simulate the institutions shaping their world. They cannot foresee how a policy will ripple through the economic ecosystem, how a technological innovation will disrupt labor markets, or how a geopolitical shift will alter global alliances. They react to changes as they arise, often with limited context. This reactive posture keeps them perpetually one step behind. When they resist, they do so without full understanding. When they adapt, they do so without full agency. They are navigating a labyrinth whose architects possess a complete map while they hold only fragmented clues. The asymmetry extends into biology as well. Advances in biotechnology, neuroscience, and psychophysiology allow institutions to understand human bodies and brains with unprecedented precision. They know how stress alters decision-making, how fatigue affects moral judgment, how hormonal cycles influence mood, how sensory environments shift cognitive patterns. This knowledge applied at scale can shape the conditions under which people work, learn, shop, vote, or socialize. When you understand the biological rhythms of a population, you can design environments that subtly guide behavior without coercion. You can encourage productivity, complacency, or compliance through architectural choices, sensory stimuli, and digital interfaces. People feel as though they are acting freely, but their range of perceived options has been gently steered. This biological understanding becomes especially powerful when combined with behavioral data. A system that knows your emotional patterns, sleep habits, social interactions, and consumption history can anticipate moments when you are receptive to certain influences or vulnerable to certain pressures. It can time notifications, offers, or messages for maximum effect. It can identify when you are lonely, anxious, or distracted, and use that moment to encourage specific actions. This is not manipulation in the crude sense of overt persuasion. It is a form of soft influence rooted in intimate knowledge. And those who possess this knowledge hold a hidden advantage over those who do not even realize such patterns are being tracked. The phrase, "they know something we don't," thus captures not a single truth, but an entire landscape of uneven knowledge. It reflects an emotional undercurrent that many people sense but cannot articulate. They sense that their lives are shaped by forces they do not fully understand, that their choices are filtered through systems they did not design, that their futures are being forecast by models they have never seen. This sense of opacity breeds mistrust, and mistrust can destabilize societies. When people believe the world is governed by hidden mechanisms, they may turn to conspiracy theories as a substitute for transparency. These theories are often inaccurate, yet they emerge from a legitimate psychological need, the need to believe that power is comprehensible. The tragedy is that the real asymmetry is not secret in the dramatic sense, it is secret in the structural sense, hidden by complexity rather than intention. Complexity itself becomes a form of secrecy. A system need not deliberately withhold information, it only needs to be so intricate that most people cannot grasp its logic. In such a world, transparency becomes meaningless. You can provide people with documents, data, or explanations, yet, if the underlying mechanisms are too complex for ordinary comprehension, the effect is identical to secrecy. The information is technically available but practically inaccessible. This creates a society in which accountability becomes difficult to enforce. If people cannot understand how a system functions, they cannot determine whether it is malfunctioning or being misused. And when accountability weakens, so too does trust. The asymmetry also influences identity. In earlier eras, individuals defined themselves through relationships, traditions, and personal narratives. Today, identity is increasingly constructed through digital platforms that measure, categorize, and predict human behavior. These platforms know which personality traits correlate with which behaviors, which preferences reveal which psychological characteristics, which patterns of interaction signify which emotional states. They construct detailed portraits of individuals that are often more accurate than the individual's own self-perceptions. When systems know who you are better than you do, they gain the ability to shape who you will become. They can recommend paths, careers, partners, hobbies, and worldviews tailored to your predicted identity. The danger is not that these recommendations are malicious, but that they subtly mold the trajectories of millions of lives without their conscious participation. Another consequence of the asymmetry is the erosion of the boundary between public and private. People still imagine privacy in the traditional sense, the control of personal information. But privacy is no longer merely about what you choose to share. It is about what can be inferred from the traces you inadvertently leave behind. Even if you do not disclose your secrets, your patterns may reveal them. Even if you do not speak your desires, your behavior may express them. Institutions equipped with advanced analytic tools can extract unprecedented insights from these patterns. They know your routines, your anomalies, your impulses, your coping mechanisms. And because you cannot see these inferences being made, you cannot contest them. You cannot correct errors or misunderstandings, and you cannot reclaim aspects of yourself that have been misinterpreted. Your digital shadow becomes a second self over which you have limited control. This second self influences opportunities. It shapes which jobs you are offered, which prices you see, which messages you receive, which networks you access. It can open doors or silently close them. Those who manage the systems that determine these opportunities know far more about how these decisions are made than the individuals affected. Thus, inequality takes on a new dimension, the inequality of informational access.